Okay, so this morning we continue our next installment in our journey through the Bible, and just a very quick recap so that we know where we're going. The title of this series is Journey Through the Bible, and that tells us that we're going to be traveling through the story of the Bible. And this is very important for us to have a grasp on because, like I said last time, many people are intimidated by the Bible because they open it up and suddenly they're confronted with 66 books. These 66 books can be divided into 1,189 chapters, and some people feel like they get a little bit lost. But when we know where the story is going, things begin to make sense. Now, even though my goal is to provide us with clarity concerning the message of the Bible, this still will mean that there will be times when you come down to individual verses of the Bible. They still might be hard to understand, but they will be easier to understand if we know their context and how they fit in to the big story of the Bible. And there are many ways of approaching the grand message of the Scriptures, and what I've provided is just one way of doing that, and that is to look at the Bible as a journey. And on this journey, there are 9 signposts or 9 major sections. So I'll quickly mention them, and today we're going to be looking at the first one: paradise and pollution, patriarchs and promises, rescue and rebellion, conquest and cycles, kings and prophets, removal and return. That's the Old Testament. And then we come into the New Testament: Christ and cross, church and commission, punishment and paradise. Now, so that you're aware, with the exception of the first signpost, we're going to look at all of these over 2 studies. But today, we're going to do the first one in 1 study. So today, we're going to be looking at paradise and pollution. So this is signpost number 1. And what I want you to note is this first signpost. As we begin the journey, walking our way, traveling our way through the Bible, this first signpost covers the first 11 chapters of the Bible. And these first 11 chapters found in the book of Genesis are very important because they really create the foundation. The first 11 chapters of the Bible actually answer the following questions. Why are we here? Why is this world here? And not only that, why is the world the way it is today? The answers to those questions are provided in these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And I want to again stress that if you are going to understand the overall message of the Bible, you really need to be well acquainted with these first 11 chapters. Now, how can we summarize this section, which I've titled Paradise and Pollution? Well, I want you to observe that there are 4 major events found in these first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. These 4 major events can be understood under the following headings: creation, fall, flood, and confusion. These are 4 significant events. Now, just so you're aware, when we move into our next signpost, which will be Genesis 12 to 50, we're going to learn about 4 significant people. So that just quickly gives you a summary of the entire book of Genesis. 4 significant events, 4 significant people. If you can remember that, you've got the whole book of Genesis down in a sentence. But the first signpost is Genesis 1 to 11, and that is 4 significant events: creation, fall, flood, and confusion. So let's look at these one at a time. The first part of this journey is creation. And if you were to go back to the book of Genesis, particularly Genesis chapter 1, that's where we learn about this. This chapter provides us with a stunning and very specific description of how this universe came into existence. Now, in order for us to really appreciate this, just take a moment to think about the world that we live in. I've just come away this weekend from a father and son camp with Jack, and this was held up in Yarra Junction. We got to go for some bushwalking, we went caving, and in these different experiences of looking outside, looking at a starry sky of an evening, and then being in the depths of the earth inside of a cave, crawling through and having all sorts of things on your hands, and probably a lot of the time it's good that it was dark so you weren't too put off by what you're touching. It was quite amazing that this earth, this world, is incredible. It doesn't matter if you're looking at things up close or looking at things far away. This universe that we live in is vast, it is impressive, it is thrilling to be able to see and participate in. Well, this universe came into existence by means of a creator. And that's how the journey through the Bible begins. We start off with paradise, but paradise exists because God creates everything. Creation is the first major event. And I want you to notice the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now notice the Bible doesn't begin by defending the existence of God. It doesn't try to provide proof for the existence of God. It just simply assumes it. It just declares that God was there. And this God, who we learn more about as we continue to go through the journey through the Bible, is the one who brought all things into existence out of nothing. And how did he do this? We're told in Genesis chapter 1 that God spoke. And the power of his spoken word brought all things as we know it into existence. He brought a spiritual creation into existence, so that included angels. Now, we don't so much learn about them in this opening chapter. We learn about them in other parts of the Bible. But he also brought a physical creation into existence, and that's what Genesis 1 is all about. So Genesis chapter 1 can really be summarized with a few words, and that is God is the creator. In fact, if you were to trace the word God in Genesis chapter 1, you will find that it appears 32 times. Now, when you read the Bible, if you ever see something repeated, just note that, because that's an emphasis. So the emphasis of Genesis chapter 1 is God. God is the main character. God is the one that brought all things into existence. I asked the question, how did he do it? And I said he did it by means of his word. He spoke and the world came into existence. But Genesis 1 also tells us that God did this in a systematic fashion. We are told specifically that God created the world in 6 days. He spoke and the world was created. But notice something fascinating about the 6 days of creation, as we call it. We observe day 1, 2, and 3 are days where God is forming. And then days 4, 5, and 6 is where he is filling. So note, for example, on day 1, God creates light and darkness. But it's not until day 4 that he fills that light and darkness with the sun, moon, and stars. On day 2, he forms the sea and the sky. But then it's on day 5, he fills it with water creatures and birds. On day 3, God creates the land and the plants, but then he fills the land and the plants with animals and man. This is a systematic creation. It is a sophisticated creation, but we notice the symmetry, the beauty in which God is doing this. There is no mistake, and this begins to introduce us to parts of God's character. God is beautiful in his character. God is organized. God does things in a most spectacular fashion. So that's just a very interesting observation to make. And one of the big takes that you walk away from Genesis 1 is another word that's repeated. Does anyone remember the word that's repeated after each day? God creates, and what does he say? It is good, exactly. And that's what you're to walk away from Genesis 1. The idea is this is a paradise. God has created the world, and it's good. It's beautiful. It works. There's nothing wrong with it. But there is a high point of creation, and that's what takes place on day number 6, and that is the creation of man. God makes everything, but the best is saved for last. God says, let us make man in our image. Now, God had already made angels. I said to you that's not mentioned in Genesis 1, but God's already done this. Angels are highly intelligent beings, stunning creatures of great brilliance and intellect. But God creates man, similar to angels, but different. Man is going to be spiritual like angels, but man is also going to be physical. And God is going to say something about man that he will not say about anything else in his creation, and that is, man is made in his image. To be made in the image of God means that man is going to represent God specifically on earth. And in addition to representing God, man is going to resemble God in particular ways. In ways that's not true of animals, that's not true of trees and mountains, and certainly not true of angels. Man is going to be different. And we learn that God created man. He made male and female in his image, and God had arranged the very first marriage in history. Now, just note too that we have the origin of everything here in the book of Genesis. We have the origin of the universe. We have the origin of mankind. We even have the origin of marriage. Marriage is not a result of church tradition or of conservative Christians. Marriage is the result of God's idea in creation. So, interestingly enough, the word Genesis means beginnings, and this book is filled with beginnings. We have the beginning of creation, the beginning of man, and the beginning of marriage. We also have the beginning of a lot of bad things as well that we'll see in just a moment. So this is the high point of creation. God brings everything into existence. It is beautiful. It is glorious. And then you go on and read in Genesis chapter 2 about a garden that God plants. God creates the very first garden. So that's the beginning of gardens, is in Genesis chapter 2. And this is called the Garden of Eden. And interestingly, that word Eden is affiliated with the idea of paradise. It is a garden paradise. It's described as a place where it is lush. It is a place where it is replenished by a mist that comes up and waters the garden. It is described as having rivers running through it. There's gold and all sorts of things there. And there are beautiful fruit trees and animals, and there you have Adam and Eve in this garden. So you got the image. It's paradise. This is the greatest of places that you could ever imagine in your minds. So we begin our first signpost, which is about paradise and pollution, by looking at the first major event, and that is creation. We now come to the second, and that is fall. It's actually really sad that the Bible begins with this stunning starting point: creation, paradise, and Adam and Eve are there in the garden, and it is all there for them to enjoy. And just another point that I failed to mention, God gave Adam and Eve a great commission, and the commission was for them to be fruitful and multiply and spread the glory over the face of the earth. And that is what they were called to do. But how quickly things go from good to bad, from day to night, from triumph to tragedy, from paradise to pollution. How far in the Bible? Genesis 3. Wow, we've got a lot of chapters to go. And it's only in the third chapter that everything goes bad. This is the second major event in the Bible, and that's called fall. Now, even though we've got many more signposts, we could actually say that this second major event in the book of Genesis, called fall, actually goes from Genesis 3 all the way to Revelation 19. The whole story of the Bible is about the fall, and that is how everything is now polluted. As I said, we go from paradise to pollution. And what is the fall? Well, this is the event that we learn about in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we see that Adam and Eve are in this garden, and suddenly we're introduced to a bad character. Now, intriguingly, it's a talking snake. Now, just file away snake or serpent. This is going to be something that's going to be spread throughout the Bible, and it's going to be used negatively most of the time. And it's going to always be used to represent the one who possessed this particular snake. This talking snake was the devil. We know that because we go all the way to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and Revelation 12 tells us that he was the serpent of old, and it's describing the devil and Satan. So Satan, who was an angel created by God, rebelled against God, and as a result of this rebellion became the chief enemy of God. He became the leader of a group of other angels that rebelled against God. And he now has come into the garden, and his goal is to attack the goodness of God. Adam and Eve are in this beautiful paradise, and suddenly we have the entrance of sin into the world for the very first time. We are told that the serpent deceives Eve. He speaks with Eve directly. Now, it's interesting that the serpent bypasses Adam because he knew that Adam was created first and Adam was to be the leader. But the serpent bypasses Adam, directly addresses Eve, and in doing so, he questions God's goodness. Now, God had given Adam and Eve an incredible freedom, and that was they can freely eat of all the fruit of the Garden of Eden. Great freedom, great liberty, but there was one tree that they were not to eat of, and that was the tree that was of the knowledge of good and evil. There was also another key tree that we'll learn about in a moment, and that is the tree of life. But this tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the one that Adam and Eve were not to eat of it, because the day they eat of it, they will surely die, God said. Well, Satan questioned this, and Eve somewhat questioned him back, but in the end, she listened to what he said. She ate of the fruit, disobeying God blatantly, and in addition to that, she gave to her husband who was with her as well, and he ate of the fruit. And in that moment, Adam and Eve had fallen into sin. And not only had they fallen into the sin, sin has now come into paradise. And because Adam is the representative of all human beings, the entire human race became corrupt in that single moment. This is a very sad scene. So here we are on this journey, and it starts off so good, thinking, well, we stop off at this first place and we're in paradise, and very quickly we want to get past this first signpost because it is now dark, it is ugly, sin has come into the world. So Satan tempts Eve, Eve succumbs to the temptation of Satan, and sin invades the world. Adam and Eve have sinned, and immediately Adam and Eve feel the effects. Adam and Eve were naked. They weren't ashamed prior to sin coming into the world, but the moment they ate of that fruit, all of a sudden they felt different. They were now ashamed. Their conscience was plaguing them, and they tried to cover themselves with leaves. And it's interesting that God finds Adam and Eve. They can run, but they cannot hide from God. God finds them, and he calls them unto himself. And it's rather significant that God clothes Adam and Eve. He finds their attempt to dress themselves unacceptable, and he gives them animal skins. Now, the fact that he gave them animal skins implies death. An animal died. Someone was sacrificed in order for Adam and Eve to be clothed. Now, this is going to be a theme that we're going to learn through the Bible. In order for us to be acceptable before God, you can't make yourself acceptable. God must make you acceptable. Adam and Eve tried to be acceptable, but God said, no, that's not good enough. Your works, your attempt to dress yourself, I must dress you. And in order for you to be acceptable, there must be a sacrifice. That clue is there. Now, we know that that's pointing to Christ, and we'll see that clearer as we go through. But sin has entered the world. What are the effects of sin? Well, terrible effects happen. God issues effects that are, first of all, directed toward the serpent, to the woman, and then to the man. And we read all of this in Genesis 3. He says to the serpent that there is now going to become a spiritual conflict between you and the seed of the woman. In other words, there is going to be a battling rage throughout the ages in which there will be a war between God's people and Satan's people. Now, this is bad news, but there is also good news, because in Genesis 3:15 we are told, but there will come one from the seed of the woman, one who will come from the line of the woman, that the serpent will bite his heel, but this descendant of the woman will crush the serpent's head. Now again, remember that theme of the serpent's head being crushed, because we're going to mention that throughout this series. And that is talking about Jesus Christ. Theologians call Genesis 3:15 the first gospel. That's where the first gospel is. So the first effect is that there is going to be a raging battle of conflict, not blessing, conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Then the Lord looks at Eve and says, Eve, there are consequences toward you as well. You're going to now have pain in childbearing. And this is something that is going to be carried throughout the ages. And this certainly is talking about the physical pain and the anguish that a woman will go through in the process of childbirth. But we are also attached to that more than the physical pain. It is also talking about all complications associated with childbearing. So this will mean the inability to have children. And the book of Genesis is going to give us many examples of this effect, that there's going to be many barren women who were unable to have children. It's also going to talk about complications in the process of birth. It's going to talk about miscarriage and other such things. So this is one of the effects that hits the woman. So this is bad news, but there's good news, because eventually through this woman is going to come a child that is going to bring about salvation. And finally, the Lord looks at Adam and says, there are effects that are going to hit you too. You are laboring in the land, and the land is no longer going to cooperate with you. You had a beautiful garden, Adam, but now there's going to be weeds. Now there's going to be problems. There's going to be disasters. There's going to be famines. There's going to be earthquakes. All these things, these disasters of the land are going to hit you and strike you. So in this second major event in this first section talks about the fall. We now come to the third major section, and this is a considerable one that we learn about in Genesis 6 all the way through the end of chapter 9, and that is the flood. Now, by the time we come to Genesis chapter 6, and I want you to notice here three words that become a cycled theme throughout the Bible. We're going to see rebellion, ruin, and then restoration. This is going to be the ongoing story through the journey through the Bible. In Genesis chapter 6, we learn that the world becomes largely populated. It doesn't take very long, particularly when you've got people in Genesis chapter 5 who are living for over 900 years. Does anyone remember the name of the man who lived the longest in the Bible? And what's his name? Methuselah. And 5 points for how old he was. 969, fantastic. 10 points, Kathy. You were so quick with that one. That is fantastic. Now, that's not to say that he was literally the oldest man, because there may have been others older. We don't know, but he's certainly the oldest mentioned. So you have individuals living that long, and notice in Genesis 5 that they lived, and there's a recurrence of the word, and he died, and he died. Death is reigning through the world. But by the time we come to Genesis 6, the world is hugely populated. And all of a sudden, we learn in the opening verses, particularly in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 to 8, about the rebellion that is now taking place in the earth. We read in Genesis 6, and look at verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This is a terrible rebellion that's taking place. God had made everything good, and all of a sudden sin has come into the world, and sin is bringing about this horrible rebellion. Mankind is rejecting God. Mankind is wanting to live their way and not God's way. And every time we see rebellion in the Bible, every time we see rebellion in our society, it will always be followed by a ruin. And that's what then happens. We learn in Genesis 6 that when the Lord saw this, he was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Verse 7, the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. God is going to ruin it all. He's going to bring it down. He's going to destroy it. But notice in verse 8, there was a man that found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the kindness of God. God placed grace upon one man, and that man is Noah. Now, Noah was a man that loved the Lord, but he was not a perfect man. But God was gracious. And if God is ever going to bring about restoration, it must always be by his grace. We can't cause God's grace to come toward us because it wouldn't be grace. Grace is God's kindness that we don't deserve. And God chooses to show kindness. Now, why does God preserve one man and not wipe everyone out? God would be right to do that, right? Because he's holy. But remember the promise he made in Genesis 3:15 that there will be a descendant from the woman? So in order for that to be achieved, the human race must not be wiped out completely. So God has a plan. And in order to achieve this plan, he is still going to punish, because he must, that's his character, but he's going to be gracious. So he brings ruin, and the ruin is seen in the flood. God asked Noah, he gives him specific plans in Genesis 6, verses 11 to 17, to build an ark. This ark is to be made of gopher wood, and it is to be 140 meters long, it is to be 32 meters high, and it is to be 14 meters wide. So in doing so, this ark is going to be quite a large vessel. And this large vessel is going to house Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, and a large number of animals, 2 of every kind, and in addition to that, 7 of some clean animals so that they can sacrifice them on the ark in worship of God. And God then brings a flood that goes global, and it destroys all living flesh, and this is such a significant flood that in Genesis 7 and verse 20 we see that the waters are so high that they were 7 meters above the highest mountains. So this is huge, a significant flood and devastation that hits the earth, and in the end, Noah and his family are in this ark, and at the appropriate time, Noah, by making use of a raven and then later on a dove, finds out if the land is dry, waits the command of God, and God tells them to come out of the ark. And what's significant in this restoration, which is found in Genesis chapter 8, is that Noah comes out of the ark, and it's like he's a new Adam. I want you to notice something very fascinating. In Genesis chapter 8, note that it says that the fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed, the rain from the heavens were restrained. But the fountains of the deep, last time you see that word, it's in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. There is this deep, and that's how the creation scene begins. Now all of a sudden the word deep is mentioned again. But not only that, it gets even more interesting. Notice that we read in verse 3 that at the end of 150 days the waters had abated, and on the 7th month, on the 17th day of that month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. What month did the ark rest? The 7th month. What day did God rest in Genesis chapter 1? The 7th day. Now it's interesting that the flood began on the second month, we are told, of the particular calendar at that time. And it's interesting that on the second day of creation, we have references to waters. So the waters are referenced on the second day in Genesis chapter 1, and the waters come down on the second month in the book of Genesis at the time of the flood. On the 7th day of creation, God rests, but on the 7th month, we learn that the ark rests. Moses, who's writing this, is trying to show you this is like a new creation. It's like everything's starting all over again. And it gets even more interesting because we have references here to Noah being commanded to have dominion over the animals, all these commands given to Adam. But there are now differences because the world isn't perfect. Noah and his family are carrying something that wasn't removed, and it's inside of them. It's sin. So even though he comes out like a new Adam, it's all glorious. It's almost like, yes, everything's starting again. We're going back to paradise. Very quickly, things go bad. We learn that Noah's son Ham performs an act of great sinfulness and God curses him. We find out that Noah plants a vineyard using the goodness of God's creation but gets drunk. All of a sudden, Everything's been made fresh, but sin is still reigning. There are problems going on in this world. So though there was a rebellion, God brought ruin. Then he brought about this beautiful restoration with Noah and his family. We now come to the final major event in this first signpost, and that is confusion. This is Genesis chapter 11. Now what happens in Genesis 11? I only want to just reference the first 9 verses of this chapter. And this is seen in the event of the Tower of Babel. Now we learn in Genesis 11 verse 1 that the whole earth had one language and the same words. So I want you to notice in Genesis 11, this is another beginning that we're going to be introduced to, and this is the beginning of languages, of multiple languages. Today, we have multiple languages. If I'm to survey this room, I'm sure that quite a number of languages could be represented in terms of what you know or at least are familiar with. Where did that begin? It began here in Genesis 11. Now, at this point of the journey through the Bible, only the first signpost, everyone spoke the same language. Could you imagine that? That would have been pretty handy. No Google Translate. None of that. I've got in trouble using Google Translate because I found out it's not always accurate. I ended up asking a very embarrassing question to someone once using Google Translate. And you could see the conversation was lost in translation as we were speaking. But imagine a world where everyone was able to communicate with one language. It would have been so efficient, so effective. But there was a problem. God had given everyone this one language, but we learn that a vast majority of the people had settled in one location. Now, this was a problem because God wanted mankind to spread his glory around the world. Here we see another rebellion. Now, back in Genesis 6, there was rebellion, then there was ruin, then there was restoration. It's not very long. We're only now in Genesis 11, and we go back to rebellion again. Mankind's like, you know what, we're just going to live our own way. It's like they've forgotten. Did you remember that God destroyed the world by a flood? We're going to do our own thing. We're going to live our way. We've got our plans. In fact, we learn about the people's pride in this section. The people arrogantly say in verse 3, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." What are the people saying? The people are saying, let's just make a great name for ourselves. Let's make a reputation in which our greatness, our glory will be seen. It's about us. Let's make this. Let's make us, our agenda, our plans, our priorities, the chief of what we do. And I want you to notice that this here is, that they're going to build a tower called the Tower of Babel. And Babel is the very first reference to a significant city that's going to be repeated through the Bible, and it's always mentioned negatively. Can anyone tell me what the city is called? It's later on changed with a different name. Babylon, exactly. And I want you to notice that we see here that Babylon is developed in Genesis 11. But I want you to notice by the time you come to Revelation 17 and 18, Babylon is destroyed. This great reversal happens. So just remember Babylon. It's going to come up many times. Babylon is a real city, but it comes to represent the center of evil in the Bible, the center of evil. And we're going to learn about it in some of the middle stories, particularly in the book of Daniel, about Babylon. So these people are gathered in what will be called Babylon, and they are wanting to build a tower and a city that just simply shows how great they are. Now, it's interesting that this sets the stage for something that happens in our next signpost. What did the people say? Let's make a name great for ourselves. And there is a man in Genesis 11 that God appears to, chooses. His name is Abram. And what does God say to him? I'm going to make you a great name and nation. It's almost like the people want to make themselves great, but God said, that's not how it works. I'm the one who makes people great, and I'm going to make you great, but it's going to be different to what the world wants and what the world does. So the people have this pride, and just notice that they say, come, let us do this, verse 3. Come, let us do this, verse 4. And then we move to the Lord's power, and I love the irony because it says in verse 5 that these people who are building this great big tower, the Lord says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower. Do you see the humor there? They're building this massive tower saying, look how high it is. And the Lord's like, well, let's just go down and have a look at that little tower. So the Lord comes down. It just squashes the pride of man. And remember, they said, come, let us do this. And then God says in verse 7, come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. And the Lord did this, and it destroyed their project. They could no longer cooperate with one another because they didn't understand one another. And all of a sudden, someone would ask for a hammer, and the other guy would think, what's this guy saying? I don't understand a word that he's doing. The project ceased. And all of a sudden, people started discovering, okay, this guy over here speaks the same language as me, so I've got to hang out with him. And all of a sudden, people were put into groups, and that's where they began to migrate into different locations. We have the beginning of nations forming here as well. So this first section of our journey through the Bible introduces us to this signpost, paradise and pollution. If we're going to understand this, we need to remember the four significant events of Genesis 1 to 11: creation, fall, flood, and confusion. Now, after this signpost, we're going to move to number 2, and that is patriarchs and promises. So we're going to pick that up next time, and we're going to, next Sunday morning, look at the life of Abraham. And then after that, the following week, we'll look at Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Well, that's where we'll finish.